Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome to this quiet space, a place where minds slow down and hearts rest. Before we begin this gentle, sleepy journey, just a small moment of support. If this meditation brings you calm, comfort, or clarity, please subscribe to the channel, gently tap the like button, and leave a comment to let us know you are here. Your support helps us continue creating these peaceful spaces for your mind, for your heart. Now, there is nothing else you need to do, nothing to think about. Let's begin. Close your eyes now and slowly settle into a comfortable position. Take a gentle breath in and slowly breathe out. Let your shoulders relax, let your jaw loosen, and allow your whole body to feel heavy. Now, let's gently explore something many of us have felt, even if we've never named it. Somewhere, right now, a city is sleeping. The streets hold their breath. The traffic lights blink through their rotations with no one watching. Awnings sag with the slight weight of overnight dew. A cat moves along a stone wall, silent and purposeful, and then disappears into shadow. The only sounds are small and peripheral. The distant rumble of a truck on a highway somewhere. The quiet conversation of wind through a gap in a window frame. The soft exhale of a world that has finally, after a long and busy day, chosen stillness. And in the buildings, those stacked geometries of glass and concrete, there are sleeping people. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Lying on their sides, breathing through open mouths, chests rising and falling in the slow, unconscious rhythm that the body never forgets, even in the deepest layers of sleep. They don't know they're breathing. They don't have to. Something else, something older and quieter than conscious thought, is tending to them in the dark. If you were to watch one of those sleeping people from above, suspended in the air outside their window, looking in, you might see only stillness. A figure under blankets. A face relaxed into the smooth neutrality of rest. But stillness is not emptiness. What appears still is, at a different scale, profoundly alive. The chest moves. Just barely. A fraction of an inch. But enough. Enough to draw air down through the airway, into passages that branch and narrow and branch again like the tributaries of a river system seen from an airplane window. The air travels through spaces so small and so numerous that if you could flatten all the surfaces of a human lung and lay them end to end, they would cover an area close to the size of a tennis court, folded, quietly, inside a ribcage the size of a shoebox. Oxygen crosses from air into blood. And blood, carrying that oxygen like a message in a bottle, flows outward. The heart, which is beaten, without rest, since before the person was born, pushes it along. Roughly once a second. A gentle, rhythmic insistence that the body continue. And now, let us go smaller. Let us shrink ourselves down past the visible, past the scale of organs and tissues, past the point where the naked eye would lose us entirely. Let us travel into a single cell, one of the approximately 37 trillion that make up a human body, and let us simply sit there for a moment. It is dim in here. Not dark, there is a kind of biochemical luminosity to it, the soft glow of chemical reactions happening in sequence, each one releasing and capturing tiny parcels of energy. The space around us is not empty. It is crowded with structure, long coiled threads, dense clusters of molecular machinery, membranes stacked in elaborate folds. Everything is in motion. Not the frantic motion of panic or urgency, but the continuous, purposeful movement of a place where work is always happening. Molecules arrive and are processed. Signals come in from outside and are interpreted. Structures are built. Older ones are dismantled. And somewhere in the center of all of this, tucked inside a membrane within the membrane, coiled strands of information sit in the nucleus, carrying instructions that have been copied and passed forward across billions of years. This is a living cell. And all of this, is biology. We tend to think of biology as a school subject, as a category of textbooks and classroom diagrams and labeled drawings of frogs. But biology is something far more fundamental than that. It is the study of how matter, ordinary matter, the same kind of matter that makes up rocks and rivers and distant stars, learned, over vast stretches of time, to arrange itself into something capable of movement, response, growth, reproduction, and, eventually, thought. Biology is the story of how the universe developed a way of knowing itself. That is not a metaphor intended to make science sound mystical. It is simply, when you think about it carefully, a fairly accurate description of what happened. The atoms that form every living body were forged in stellar furnaces long before the Earth existed. They were scattered through space, gathered into planets, dissolved into ancient seas, and, through a process that researchers are still working to fully understand, assembled into the first self-replicating molecules. From that beginning, across timescales that resist easy comprehension, life elaborated itself into the extraordinary variety we see today. And here you are, at the end of that long chain of events, breathing, perhaps already drifting towards sleep, built from that same matter, carrying those same ancient instructions, continuing that same improbable experiment. The question we'll spend our time with tonight is not a simple one. It doesn't have a clean answer. It is more like a horizon than a destination. But it is worth walking toward, slowly, and without hurry. What is life, really? Not in the sense of a textbook definition, not the memorized list of characteristics that qualifies an organism for the category, but in the deeper sense. In the sense that asks, how does inanimate chemistry become a creature that can feel warmth and fear and hunger and curiosity? How does a molecule become a memory? How does a collection of cells become a self? These are not questions that biology has fully answered. They may be questions that require more than one kind of thinking to answer, more than biology alone, perhaps touching philosophy, and mathematics, and poetry, and a kind of patient attention to the world that we sometimes forget to practice. But let's begin simply. Let's begin with what we know. Let's begin with the quiet fact that right now, wherever you are, something remarkable is happening inside you. And has been, without interruption, since the very beginning. Let that settle for a moment. And then let us begin. Consider, for a moment, the concept of a boundary. Not a wall, exactly. Not something hard and impermeable. But a threshold, a surface that separates inside from outside, that maintains a difference between what is here and what is there, and in doing so, creates the conditions for something called identity. Every living thing begins with such a boundary. The cell membrane, a structure so thin that millions of them stacked together would still be invisible to the unaided eye, is one of the most important inventions in the history of life. And invention is perhaps the wrong word, because no one designed it. It arrived, through the slow logic of chemistry and chance, as a natural consequence of how certain molecules behave when placed in water. Some molecules have one end that loves water and one end that avoids it. When many of these molecules are gathered together in a watery environment, they spontaneously arrange themselves into sheets, their water-loving ends facing outward, their water-avoiding ends tucked inward, away from the surrounding liquid. Two such sheets, pressed back to back, form a double layer, and a double layer, curved into a sphere, forms a membrane. A membrane forms a cell. And a cell, in some sense, forms the possibility of life. Inside that membrane is an environment that the cell works constantly to maintain. The fluid within is called cytoplasm, and it is not simply a passive liquid. It is a medium full of activity, a kind of crowded interior ocean where thousands of chemical reactions occur simultaneously. Proteins move through it, performing specific tasks like molecular craftspeople, each one shaped in a precise way that determines the kind of work it can do. Sugars are processed. Waste products are expelled. Energy is captured and stored. Messages are sent and received. The cytoplasm is, in its own quiet way, a place of extraordinary organization. And organizing all of this is information. At the heart of most cells, in a compartment surrounded by its own inner membrane, lives the nucleus. And inside the nucleus, coiled into dense configurations called chromosomes, is DNA. We'll spend more time with DNA in the next section. But for now, let us simply say this. The nucleus is something like a reference library. Not a library where you go to read for pleasure, but one that contains the instructions for building and operating the entire structure around it. Those instructions are constantly being accessed, copied in part, and carried out to the rest of the cell in the form of smaller molecules that direct the making of proteins. The nucleus doesn't manufacture anything directly. It delegates, it stores, and it protects its information with considerable care. A single cell, then, is not a simple thing. It is more like a dimly lit city seen from above at night, its streets too small to see clearly, but glowing with the lights of thousands of ongoing processes, each one connected to others, each one dependent on others. There is no central command issuing orders. The organization emerges from the interactions themselves, from the reliable behavior of molecules following the laws of chemistry in a space small enough for their effects to accumulate into something coherent. We have known about cells since the 17th century, when Robert Hooke placed a thin slice of cork under a crude microscope and noticed the small compartments within. He called them cells because they reminded him of the small rooms, cells, where monks lived. He did not know, could not have known, that what he was seeing was not the dead architecture of a plant but the ghosts of living units, the walls remaining long after the living contents had dried away. Now, centuries later, we understand that those compartments were not simply structural features. They were the fundamental units of life itself. Every living organism is either a single cell or a community of cells. The smallest bacteria are single cells, complete, self-sufficient, extraordinarily ancient in their design. A mushroom is made of cells. So is a sequoia tree, which may stand for thousands of years, growing taller than most buildings, and yet is built entirely from units invisible to the naked eye. A human being is built from cells of remarkable variety. There are cells shaped like discs, carrying oxygen through blood vessels. There are cells with long, branching arms that send and receive electrical signals across the nervous system. There are cells that patrol the body looking for damage or intruders. There are cells that form the lining of the gut, sampling the contents of the digestive system. There are cells in the retina of the eye that respond to individual photons of light, single particles of what we call seeing. Each of these cells, different as they appear, carries the same DNA. They are built from the same original instruction set, the same foundational text. What differs between them is which parts of that text are active, which instructions are being read and followed, and which are being ignored. A liver cell and a skin cell contain identical genetic information but behave in completely different ways because different portions of their shared instructions are being used. This is one of the more quietly astonishing facts about living things. A human body contains hundreds of distinct cell types, each performing specialized functions, each shaped differently, each expressing only a subset of its genetic potential, and yet all of them are descendants of a single cell that existed at the moment of fertilization. One cell. Billions of cells. The same instructions. Thousands of different outcomes. This is not magic. It is biology, which is, in some ways, even more interesting. There are cells that live for only a few days before being replaced. There are cells in the lens of the eye that, researchers believe, are never replaced at all. They stay with you your entire life, laid down before you were even born, witnessing every ray of light you have ever seen. There are nerve cells in the brain that have been with you since infancy, carrying the accumulated weight of every experience you've had. And there are cells, the platelets in your blood, that live for only about 10 days, doing their work and then giving way to new ones. A living body is not a static structure. It is a process. A river that holds its shape while the water flowing through it is always new. The cell, in all its forms and specializations, is where that process happens. It is the unit of life's accounting, the fundamental site where energy is transformed, information is expressed, and the boundary between living and not living is maintained. Let us now move inward further still, into the instruction set itself. There is something deeply strange about the concept of inherited memory. Not the memory of experiences, the kind you access when you recall a face, or a smell, or the feeling of sun on your arm on a particular afternoon. But a deeper kind of memory. A memory of how to be. A memory stored not in the brain but in every cell of the body, written in a language so compressed and efficient that it would take decades of reading, at a page per minute, to get through a single human's copy of it. This is DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid is a molecule, and like all molecules, it is made of atoms, specifically, a backbone of sugars and phosphates, with a sequence of smaller units called bases attached along the inside. There are 4 of these bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and they are conventionally abbreviated as a T, G, and C. The sequence in which they appear, along a strand of DNA that, if fully uncoiled and stretched out, would extend to roughly 2 meters in a single human cell, encodes information in much the same way that a sequence of letters encodes language. But blueprint is too simple a word for what DNA is. A blueprint implies a fixed, one-to-one correspondence between the plan and the structure that results from it. DNA is something more nuanced. It is closer to a vast library of conditional instructions, suggestions that might be followed or ignored depending on context, timing, the presence of certain signals, the history of the cell, and the environment in which all of this is taking place. The relationship between DNA and what a living organism becomes is not a simple one-to-one translation. It is more like a conversation, an ongoing dialogue between the genetic information and the circumstances in which it finds itself. The same stretch of DNA can give rise to very different outcomes depending on what is happening around it. This is one reason why identical twins, who carry essentially the same genetic information, can differ in significant ways as they age. Their environments, their choices, and even chance events at the cellular level shape how their shared genetic text is expressed. Let us focus for a moment on one of the most important things that DNA does: replicate itself. Every time a cell divides, which in the human body happens billions of times each day, the DNA inside it must be copied, so that each daughter cell receives its own complete set of instructions. This copying process is managed by a collection of molecular machinery that moves along the DNA strand, reading it and assembling a new complementary strand alongside it. The pairing rules are simple. A always pairs with T, and G always pairs with C. So each strand of the double helix serves as a template for the construction of its partner. This process is remarkably accurate. Estimates suggest that for every billion or so base pairs copied, only about one error is made. And many of those errors are caught and corrected by additional molecular proofreading systems. The fidelity of DNA replication is, by any measure, extraordinary. But it is not perfect. Sometimes errors slip through. Sometimes external factors, radiation, certain chemicals, even random thermal fluctuation, alter a base pair in ways that the proofreading systems miss. These alterations are called mutations. Mutation is a word that can carry alarming connotations. In popular culture, it often suggests dramatic transformation, a creature becoming something radically other than what it was. But in biology, most mutations are far more quiet than that. Many have no detectable effect at all. Some occur in regions of DNA that are not actively used. Others alter a single instruction in a way that makes no meaningful difference to the organism's function. Occasionally, a mutation causes harm, disrupting a cellular process in ways that lead to disease. And, rarely, across the vast span of evolutionary time, a mutation turns out to be something useful, providing its carrier with some small advantage that helps the altered version of the instruction persist across generations. This last possibility, the quiet accumulation of useful variations, is the raw material of evolution. But we will come to that shortly. For now, consider the sheer scale of the genetic library. A human genome contains roughly 3 billion base pairs. That sequence of letters A, T, G, C, repeated 3 billion times in a specific order, carries the instructions for assembling and operating a human body. If you were to print that sequence in a standard font, at a standard book size, the resulting volumes would fill a small library. And yet that library is packed, in its entirety, into a space smaller than 1,000th of a millimeter, and duplicated into almost every single cell in your body. Not all of the genome codes for proteins. For many years, geneticists called the portions that didn't seem to code for anything junk DNA, a perhaps premature dismissal, as researchers have since discovered that much of this apparently non-coding sequence plays important regulatory roles. It contains signals that tell protein-coding genes when to turn on and when to turn off. It contains stretches that seem to have regulatory functions we don't yet fully understand. The genome, it turns out, is less a book and more an entire ecosystem of text, with layers of annotation, cross-reference, and context that researchers are still working to map. One of the things that strikes many people when they learn about genetics is the degree to which it challenges the idea of fixed identity. We often speak of genetic information as though it determines who we are, as though the sequence of letters in our DNA writes our story in advance and we simply live it out. But the emerging picture from decades of genetics research is considerably more complicated than that. Gene expression, the process by which the information in DNA is actually read and used, is dynamic, context-sensitive, and responsive to experience in ways that continue to surprise researchers. The field of epigenetics studies the ways in which the activity of genes can be altered without changing the underlying DNA sequence, through chemical modifications that affect how accessible different parts of the genome are to the molecular machinery that reads it. DNA, in this view, is not destiny. It is potential. It is a set of tendencies and possibilities that interact with development, environment, and chance to produce an individual organism. The same genetic starting point can give rise to different outcomes. The same environmental pressure can have different effects on organisms with different genetic backgrounds. Life is not a formula with a predetermined answer. It is more like an ongoing calculation, updated constantly, responsive to new information, never fully resolved. And it has been running, in one form or another, for close to 4 billion years. That is a long time to accumulate small changes. There is a mountain in Scotland made of some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. Stand on it, and the stone beneath your feet may have formed roughly 3 billion years ago, predating even the first complex cells, let alone anything we would recognize as an animal. It is, quite literally, older than visible life. To hold that in your mind, to really try to feel the weight of 3 billion years, is a quietly humbling experience. Our entire written history fits into the last 5,000 years or so. Our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. The dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. And yet single-celled life was already ancient, already diversifying and adapting, long before any of that. Time is the medium in which evolution works. And it works slowly, imperceptibly so from the perspective of a single human life, but with extraordinary power across the timescales biology operates on. The core observation at the heart of evolutionary theory is simple enough, once you've seen it. Organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. Those offspring vary, not dramatically, but slightly, from one another and from their parents. Some of those variations, by chance, are better suited to current conditions than others. Organisms with those better suited variations are more likely to survive long enough to reproduce, and to pass their variations on to the next generation. Over time, across many generations, the characteristics of a population shift in the direction of whatever traits have been, in that environment, advantageous. This is natural selection. And it is worth being careful about how we describe it, because it is easy to get wrong. Natural selection does not try to do anything. It has no foresight. It does not plan for the future or optimize toward any goal. It is simply the name we give to the statistical consequence of differential reproduction. Some variants leave more descendants than others, and so those variants become more common over time. That is all. The appearance of design, of purpose, of clever solutions to difficult problems, all of it emerges from this single, simple, purposeless process operating across vast spans of time. The phrase survival of the fittest, often attributed to Charles Darwin, though he borrowed it from the philosopher Herbert Spencer, has done considerable damage to the popular understanding of evolution. It conjures images of violent competition, of the strong crushing the weak, of life as a brutal contest where only the most aggressive prevail. But fitness, in the biological sense, is not about strength or aggression. It is simply a measure of reproductive success. A small, slow-moving organism that produces many offspring in a particular environment may be fitter than a large, powerful one that reproduces rarely. Cooperation can be advantageous. Camouflage can be advantageous. The ability to tolerate drought can be advantageous. What is advantageous depends entirely on circumstances. And circumstances change. This is why evolution has produced such staggering diversity. Consider the variety of forms that life has taken. The spiraling geometry of a nautilus shell. The translucent body of a jellyfish drifting in dim ocean water. The extraordinarily long neck of a giraffe, reaching for leaves that shorter-necked competitors cannot reach. The hollow bones of a bird, reducing weight to make flight possible. The echolocation of a bat, which navigates darkness by listening to the reflections of its own calls. The remarkable camouflage of an octopus, which can change both the color and texture of its skin in the space of a second. None of these features was designed. All of them were shaped, over generations, over millennia, over millions of years, by the quiet logic of differential reproduction. Variations that helped their carriers leave more offspring persisted. Those that didn't, faded. The world is full of the accumulated results of this process. And it is genuinely difficult, once you understand what you're seeing, to look at any living thing without a sense of quiet wonder at the depth of history embedded in its form. Evolution is sometimes described as a branching tree, with the original common ancestor of all life at the base, and the great variety of living species spread across countless branches at the periphery. This image is useful, but it slightly misrepresents the reality. Because the tree of life is not a static diagram. It is more like a river system that has been flowing for billions of years, constantly branching, occasionally merging, some branches going dry while others widen and multiply. And it continues to flow, right now, in every generation of every species currently alive. We are not at the end of evolution. We are in the middle of it, as all living things always are. One of the most surprising things that modern genetics has revealed is just how deeply related all living things are. The genetic code, the set of rules that translates DNA sequences into proteins, is essentially the same in bacteria, in oak trees, in earthworms, in humans. The machinery of replication, the basic architecture of cellular metabolism, the fundamental chemistry of energy, all of it is strikingly similar across the enormous range of life on Earth. This is very strong evidence that all living things share a common origin. That somewhere, close to 4 billion years ago, a single lineage of self-replicating chemistry gave rise to everything that has lived since. We are, in some sense, distant cousins of every organism on this planet. The bacteria in the soil, the mosses on a stone wall, the fish in the river, the yeast that leavens bread, connected by a kinship that stretches further back than any of us can easily imagine. That kinship does not diminish us. If anything, it situates us, in the most profound possible way, within the community of life. There is a law, deep in the foundations of physics, that order cannot be maintained for free. To keep a room tidy requires effort. Without continuous input of energy, your energy, spent cleaning and organizing, a room will, over time, drift toward disorder. Dishes accumulate. Dust settles. Things are misplaced and not returned. This tendency of systems to move from ordered to disordered states is called entropy. And it is one of the most reliable patterns in the physical universe. A living cell is an island of extraordinary order in a world that tends, always, toward disorder. And maintaining that order requires a constant supply of energy. This is why every living thing must eat. Or, if it cannot eat, must capture energy in some other form. Life is, among other things, an energy management system. It takes an energy from outside. uses that energy to do the work of building and maintaining and reproducing, and releases the remainder as heat. The moment the energy supply is cut off, the moment a cell can no longer fuel its own processes, the ordered structures begin to collapse, and the boundary between living and not living is crossed. The currency of biological energy is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, ATP. It is worth knowing its name, even if the chemistry isn't your primary interest, because it is genuinely ubiquitous in life. Every time a muscle contracts, every time a neuron fires, every time a cell copies a strand of DNA, ATP is involved. It is the molecular unit of energy exchange in the living world, the common denomination into which the energy from food is converted, and from which the energy for cellular work is drawn. ATP is produced primarily in structures called mitochondria, organelles present in most complex cells, bounded by their own membranes, and possessing a fascinating evolutionary history. Evidence strongly suggests that mitochondria were once free-living bacteria that, hundreds of millions of years ago, entered into a symbiotic relationship with another type of cell, and were, over time, incorporated into it. They still carry their own small genome, a remnant of their independent past. Every mitochondrion in your cells is a descendant of that ancient partnership, still performing the same fundamental chemistry it evolved to perform. Now in service of the larger organism it has become part of. The process by which mitochondria generate ATP, called cellular respiration, involves dismantling glucose molecules from food, extracting the energy stored in their chemical bonds through a sequence of carefully controlled reactions, and using that energy to build ATP from simpler components. Oxygen is used in this process, and carbon dioxide is released as a byproduct. This is why breathing brings oxygen in, and why we exhale carbon dioxide out. The exchange at the surface of the lungs connects the external environment to the innermost chemistry of our cells. Plants, and some other organisms, have developed a different approach to acquiring energy. Instead of consuming other organisms for the energy stored in their tissues, they capture energy directly from light, using structures called chloroplasts. These two, evidence suggests, were once free-living photosynthetic bacteria that were incorporated into the cells of ancestral algae long ago. Through the process of photosynthesis, chloroplasts use the energy of sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose, storing solar energy in the chemical form that the rest of the food web will eventually draw on. The grass uses sunlight to make sugars. The deer eats the grass, and its mitochondria convert those sugars into ATP. A wolf eats the deer, and its mitochondria do the same. At every level of the food chain, energy flows from the sun, through photosynthesis, through digestion, through cellular respiration, eventually dissipating as heat, as the entropy that cannot be avoided. What life achieves, in this energetic context, is something remarkable. It maintains order, beautifully, elaborately, dynamically, for as long as it can sustain the energy flow that makes order possible. A tree does not defeat entropy. It borrows against it, continuously, using sunlight as collateral. An animal does not escape entropy. It delays it, day by day. With every meal, Every breath, every exchange of energy between food and movement and warmth. Life is a temporary rebellion against the universe's tendency toward dissolution. But rebellion is perhaps too dramatic a word for something that is, at its core, so quiet and so patient. It is more like a sustained conversation with entropy. A negotiation that goes on for as long as there is energy to keep talking. And in the meantime, something extraordinary is built from that borrowed order. Something that can breathe, and grow, and sense, and remember, and wonder. Imagine a single cell floating in the ocean. It has no neighbors, or very few. It drifts in the currents, absorbing what it needs from the water around it, sensing chemical gradients, a slight increase in the concentration of nutrients in one direction, and moving toward them in a process that is more chemistry than decision, more gradient following than intention. It has no brain. It has no nervous system. It has, in fact, no organs at all. And yet it responds to its environment. It detects and reacts. In a very primitive sense, it senses. This capacity for sensing, for taking in information about the external world and adjusting behavior in response, is one of the foundational properties of life. And as organisms grew more complex, the structures that carry out this function grew more elaborate, more specialized, and more capable. The simplest animal nervous systems, found in creatures like jellyfish and sea anemones, are not centralized. They are distributed, networks of interconnected nerve cells spread through the organism's body like a net, with no particular center of control. A stimulus on one part of the body produces a coordinated response, but there is no place where that response is decided, it simply propagates through the network. Such nerve nets are elegant in their simplicity, and effective in their range. They have persisted for hundreds of millions of years. And the organisms that carry them are among the most successful in the ocean. As some lineages of animals became more complex, developing more elaborate bodies, moving through three-dimensional environments, encountering a wider variety of challenges, their nervous systems became more centralized. Cells that process information began to cluster together. Clusters grew into ganglia. Ganglia elaborated into brains, where incoming signals from the senses converge, interact, and produce coordinated responses. The fundamental unit of all of this is the neuron. A neuron is a cell with a distinctive shape, a compact cell body from which extend long, branching projections. Some of these projections receive signals from other neurons. One longer projection, the axon, carries signals outward to the next neuron in the chain. The signal itself, an electrochemical event called an action potential, travels down the axon like a wave, propagating forward through a process involving the rapid movement of electrically charged particles across the cell membrane. To watch a neuron fire, in the imagination, at least, is to watch something like a very small, very fast form of lightning. A wave of electrical change moves down a thin filament, sometimes wrapped in a white insulating sheath that makes it look, under a microscope, like a wire. At the far end, the arriving signal triggers the release of chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, into the tiny gap between one neuron and the next. Those chemical messengers cross the gap and bind to receptors on the receiving cell, potentially triggering another action potential in turn. This is how your brain is talking to itself right now. This is how the sensation of reading or listening to these words is being processed, interpreted, held in working memory, through cascades of electrochemical events happening in fractions of a millisecond. across a network of roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others, producing a total number of connections so large that counting them meaningfully is essentially impossible. The progression from a simple nerve net to a complex brain is not a straight line, and it is not a hierarchy of worth. A jellyfish and a crow are not on different rungs of the same ladder. They are on different branches of a very large tree, each adapted to its own context, each possessing exactly the neural complexity required for the kind of life it leads. Still, it is worth pausing on what centralized nervous systems made possible. With a brain comes the possibility of learning, of adjusting behavior based not on immediate chemical gradients alone, but on past experience. With a brain comes the possibility of memory, of anticipation, of what we might cautiously call planning. Nervous systems opened up new dimensions of behavioral flexibility, allowing organisms to navigate changing environments in ways that purely genetic adaptation, which works across generations, cannot match. The axolotl regrowing its own limb, the crow dropping stones into a container to raise the water level, the elephant returning, year after year, to the bones of a member of its herd, the octopus unscrewing a jar. These are all expressions, in their different ways, of nervous systems doing what they evolved to do: sensing, processing, remembering, adjusting, and you, lying still in the dark. Your own nervous system managing the breathing you're not thinking about, the temperature regulation you're not attending to, the thousand small adjustments that keep the interior of your body stable while the mind drifts towards sleep, are carrying that same long tradition forward. There is a version of the human body that lives in textbooks, a simplified illustration of systems laid out side by side, each clearly labeled, each depicted as though it operates in tidy isolation from the others. The digestive system, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the immune system, presented in sequence, as though they take turns. The actual body is nothing like that. The actual body is an ecosystem, not a machine, or not only a machine, but a living community of systems that are so deeply intertwined, so mutually dependent, that separating them even for the purpose of description does them a certain violence. Still, let us walk through some of them, slowly and without hurry, and try to hold in mind, as we do, that everything we mention is happening simultaneously, all at once, coordinated by a communication network of staggering complexity. Begin with the heart. The heart is a muscle, which is to say, it is a mass of cells that have specialized in the capacity to contract. Cardiac muscle cells are unusual among muscle cells in that they contract rhythmically without receiving a signal from the brain to do so. They have their own electrical pacemaker, a small cluster of cells in the upper right chamber of the heart that fires spontaneously, generating the electrical signal that spreads through the cardiac muscle and causes it to contract in a coordinated wave. The brain can modulate this rate, slowing it during rest, accelerating it during exertion, but it does not initiate it. The heart, in a very real sense, drives itself. With each contraction, blood is pushed outward. The vessels it travels through range from the aorta, the body's largest artery, roughly the width of a garden hose, to capillaries so narrow that red blood cells must pass through them single file, squeezing against the vessel walls where oxygen and nutrients can cross into the surrounding tissue. That entire journey, from heart, through arteries, through capillaries, back through veins, takes less than a minute in a resting person. Carrying the blood is a workforce of extraordinary diversity. Red blood cells, stripped of their nuclei to make room for the maximum amount of hemoglobin, the protein that binds oxygen, are among the most specialized cells in the body. They have one job: transport. They pick up oxygen at the lungs, deliver it to the tissues, collect carbon dioxide as a return cargo, and bring it back to be exhaled. A single red blood cell may complete this circuit hundreds of thousands of times before it wears out and is recycled. After about 120 days of service, the lungs, where that exchange happens, are far more complex than their outward form suggests. The inner surface is folded and subdivided into hundreds of millions of tiny air sacs, alveoli, each one surrounded by a mesh of capillaries. The gas exchange happens across membranes so thin that molecules can move through them by diffusion alone. Following the gradients of concentration, oxygen flowing from air into blood, carbon dioxide flowing from blood into air. The whole apparatus is moist, warm, and endlessly active, cycling air in and out roughly 15 times a minute, adjusting the rate and depth in response to signals from the brainstem about blood chemistry. Now consider the immune system, which is less a system than a standing army, dispersed through the entire body, maintaining a kind of constant low-grade surveillance. Most of the time, the immune system is invisible in its operation. Pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, are encountered and neutralized so efficiently that the body never produces symptoms. The heat and inflammation we associate with illness are not the disease itself but the immune response. The body's controlled, aggressive reaction to the presence of something it has identified as threatening. Fever, for example, may be a response that makes the internal environment less hospitable to certain pathogens, while also accelerating immune cell function. It is not a malfunction. It is a strategy. The immune system distinguishes self from non-self through an elaborate system of molecular markers, proteins displayed on the surface of cells that identify them as belonging to the body. Immune cells that attack self are normally suppressed or destroyed early in their development, a process of self-education that occasionally fails and results in autoimmune conditions. Immune cells that fail to recognize genuine threats may allow infections to establish themselves. The balance the immune system must strike is a genuinely difficult one. Aggressive enough to neutralize real threats, restrained enough not to attack the body's own tissues. And then there is the microbiome, the community of microorganisms that lives in and on the human body, and which researchers have increasingly come to recognize as a significant part of human biology rather than merely an accompaniment to it. The human gut alone houses trillions of microbial cells. Bacteria, archaea, fungi, and viruses, living in a complex ecology of their own. They assist in digesting food, producing vitamins, competing with pathogenic microorganisms for space and resources, and communicating with the immune system in ways that research is only beginning to trace. The specific composition of a person's gut microbiome varies considerably from one individual to another. is shaped by diet and environment and history, and appears to influence health in ways that extend well beyond the digestive tract. Emerging research suggests connections between the gut microbiome and immune function, metabolic health, and even, in ways that are not yet fully understood, aspects of brain function and mood. The body, in other words, is not a fortress with walls against the outside world. It is more like a living border, a semi-permeable boundary between the internal and external, populated by an enormous community of organisms that have been part of human biology for as long as there have been humans. You are not a single organism. You are, in a very real sense, an ecosystem. Let us step outside. Not far. Just into the yard. Or to the edge of a park. Or, if you can hold the image in mind, into a forest at night. The trees stand in the dark, their upper branches lost in shadow. The ground is soft with layers of decomposing leaves and fallen wood. A substance called duff. Home to an extraordinary community of organisms that rarely receives the attention it deserves. In a single handful of healthy forest soil, researchers have found thousands of species of bacteria, hundreds of species of fungi, dozens of species of invertebrates, a living mass of organisms so dense, so interwoven, that the soil itself is more accurately described as a community than a substance. This is ecology, the study of life in relationship, not individual organisms, not even species in isolation, but the full web of interactions that connects all living things in a given place and time. The most familiar way to picture ecological relationships is the food web, not the simplified food chain of a schoolroom poster, but the full complexity of who eats what in a given ecosystem. A meadow food web might include grasses consumed by insects, insects consumed by birds, birds consumed by hawks, and hawks dying and being decomposed by bacteria and fungi that return their nutrients to the soil from which the grass grows. Even this simplified description masks considerable complexity. The real relationships involve dozens of grass species, hundreds of insect species, multiple bird species, and an entire unseen world of decomposers. But ecological relationships are not only about eating. Symbiosis, the intimate and sustained interaction between different species, takes many forms, not all of which involve predation. Mycorrhizal fungi form partnerships with the roots of most plant species, extending into the soil far beyond what the plant's roots alone could reach, delivering water and nutrients to the plant in exchange for sugars. This relationship is so widespread and so old that many plants cannot survive without their fungal partners. The forest is, in part, held together by an underground network of these partnerships. Flowering plants and their pollinators, bees, butterflies, birds, bats, are another example of mutual relationship that, over evolutionary time, has shaped both partners. The flower's shape, color, scent, tuned toward attracting specific pollinators. The pollinator's body, the length of its tongue, the structure of its legs, tuned toward accessing the flower's resources. These pairings are not locked tight, but in many cases the relationship is close enough that the loss of one partner places the other in genuine difficulty. Ecology also describes the regulatory loops that keep ecosystems within a range of stability, predator and prey populations fluctuate in a loose rhythm. When prey is abundant, predators thrive. As predator numbers rise, prey populations fall. As prey becomes scarce, predator numbers decline. And so the cycle turns. No level in the system remains permanently high or permanently low. Stability, in an ecological context, is not a fixed point, but a dynamic range. A pattern of fluctuation within bounds that can persist for very long periods. This is not perfection. Ecosystems are disrupted by drought, by fire, by the arrival of new species, by the disappearance of old ones. Stability is not guaranteed, but there is a resilience in diverse, well-connected ecosystems, a capacity to absorb disturbance and continue, that ecologists find consistently across different kinds of habitats. The coral reef, home to roughly a quarter of all marine species despite covering less than 1% of the ocean floor, is an illustration of what biological interconnection can build. The reef structure itself is created by tiny animals, corals, that secrete calcium carbonate skeletons, and live in close partnership with photosynthetic algae that provide them with energy. The reef they build becomes a habitat for fish, crustaceans, mollusks, echinoderms, and thousands of other species, each playing its role: grazer, predator, cleaner, decomposer, in the web of relationships that keeps the whole system functioning. Ecology reminds us, gently but insistently, that no organism is truly separate from its context. Every living thing is embedded in relationships with the organisms it eats, with those that eat it, with those it competes with those it depends on for shelter, or pollination, or decomposition, or nutrient cycling. The boundary of the individual is real, but also, in an important sense, incomplete. We are each of us a node in a network that extends far beyond us, in space and in time. Return, for a moment, to a single cell. Not the kind of single-celled organism that lives its whole life in isolation, but a specific single cell, at a specific and extraordinary moment. The fertilized egg, the single cell from which every multicellular organism begins its existence. This cell is not unusual in appearance. It is round, bounded by its membrane, containing a nucleus with a full complement of genetic material. And yet, from this ordinary seeming starting point, a process will unfold that is, by any measure, one of the most remarkable things that happens in the biological world. The fertilized egg divides. 2 cells. Each of those divides. 4. Then 8. 16. 32. At first, all the cells in this growing cluster are equivalent. Similar in size, similar in character. Each potentially capable of becoming any type of cell in the body. But early in development, signals begin to establish different conditions in different parts of the cluster. Some cells find themselves in a position where certain signaling molecules are more concentrated. Others are in a position where other molecules predominate. These positional signals, the molecular equivalent of a landscape with different elevations, begin to tell cells something about where they are in the developing organism. And where a cell is during early development has a profound effect on what it will become. The process is called differentiation, and it works through the selective expression of genes. Every cell contains the same full set of genetic instructions, but as development proceeds, different cells begin to read different portions of that instruction set. Signals from neighboring cells, from the extracellular environment, from proteins that regulate which genes are accessible. All of these influence which instructions are activated in any given cell. At any given moment, a cell that receives one combination of signals may activate the instructions for becoming a muscle cell. Another, receiving a different set of signals, activates instructions for becoming a neuron. This coordination, this organized, sequential, context-dependent activation of different genetic programs in different cells is what turns a single fertilized egg into an organism with hundreds of cell types, arranged in specific tissues and organs, positioned correctly relative to one another, and capable of functioning together. The brain deserves a brief mention here, for the sheer scale of its developmental complexity. During the development of a human brain, neurons are generated at rates that, at the peak of prenatal development, may approach hundreds of thousands per minute. Those neurons must then migrate to the correct location, extend processes in the right directions, form connections with the right partners, and be refined through a process that continues well into childhood and adolescence by the activity patterns of the brain itself. How does all of this coordinate? How does a developing organism of billions of cells manage to produce a structure as ordered and functional as a working brain, heart, or liver, without any central director issuing instructions? The answer, as with so much in biology, is through local interactions that produce global order. Each cell is following a set of context-sensitive instructions, responding to its immediate environment, sending signals to its neighbors, adjusting its behavior based on the signals it receives in return. The result of millions of cells doing this simultaneously across time is an organism. Development is not a perfect process. Things go wrong. Genes are not expressed at the right time. Cells migrate to the wrong location. Structures form incompletely. Many fertilized eggs do not survive the early stages of development. Biology does not shy away from this reality. Development is a process of remarkable reliability given its complexity, but it is not infallible. What is astonishing is not that it sometimes fails, but that, with the extraordinary regularity that it does, it succeeds. That a single cell can unfold over the course of months into a body of 37 trillion cells, organized into muscles, nerves, organs, and senses, responsive to its environment, capable of growth and learning and awareness, is one of the quietest and most extraordinary things that happens in the universe. This is the section where certainty becomes gentler. Everything we have discussed so far, cells, DNA, evolution, energy, nervous systems, development, rests on foundations that are detailed, tested, revised, and tested again. There are open questions in every field, but the broad outlines are clear. Consciousness is different. We do not have a satisfying scientific explanation for why subjective experience exists. We can describe, in considerable detail, the neural correlates of consciousness, the patterns of brain activity that accompany particular experiences. We can trace the pathways along which sensory information travels. We can identify regions of the brain that appear crucial to awareness. But we cannot yet explain, in terms that bridge the physical and the experiential, why there is something it is like to be a brain processing information. This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Not hard merely in the sense of difficult, but hard in the sense of revealing a qualitative gap between our physical descriptions of the brain and the first-person reality of experience. It was articulated in its contemporary form by David Chalmers in the 1990s. Though the underlying question is ancient, how does physical process become felt experience? We don't know. This is not an evasion. It is an honest statement about the current state of understanding. Researchers have proposed many theories. Some emphasize specific patterns of neural integration. Some look to quantum processes within neurons. Some suggest that consciousness may be a fundamental feature of nature, rather than something that emerges only when matter reaches a certain complexity. None of these proposals has yet gathered the kind of decisive evidence that would compel consensus. All remain, for now, in the domain of hypothesis, speculation, philosophical argument. What we can say with more confidence is something about the neural complexity that consciousness, at least in the human sense, appears to require. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each neuron connected to thousands of others through trillions of synapses. The patterns of activity across this network are dynamic, ever-changing, shaped by sensory input from the body and the world, by intrinsic rhythms, by memory, by history. Different regions specialize: visual processing, language, memory, emotion, motor control. But no region operates in isolation, and the richness of conscious experience seems to depend on integration across many regions at once. When we sleep, consciousness does not vanish. It changes character. Dreams show that the brain can generate worlds, narratives, emotions, without direct input from the external environment. There are other states: anesthesia, certain forms of meditation, deep stages of sleep, in which awareness shifts, sometimes narrowing, sometimes dissolving, sometimes expanding. These states are of great interest to those who study the brain, precisely because they reveal how flexible and variable experience can be. Other animals have nervous systems and brains, and exhibit behaviors that suggest inner lives of varying richness. A crow solving a multi-step problem to reach food, an elephant returning to the bones of a herd member, an octopus exploring objects with what appears to be curiosity. These behaviors invite careful interpretation, but they also press the question outward, beyond our own species. We are not the only organisms in which the question of consciousness is biologically embedded, but we may be the only ones who ask the question aloud. That capacity for self-reflection, for turning awareness back upon itself, for wondering about the nature of one's own experience. Is itself a biological phenomenon? It arose through the same evolutionary processes that shaped hands and eyes and lungs. It is rooted in the same cellular machinery, the same electrochemical signaling, the same ancient lineage. That biology, in producing a human brain, produced something capable of asking what it is, strikes many as one of the most remarkable features of the universe. For now, let it remain a question, open, wide, quiet, and full of possibility. There is a kind of cellular death that is not a failure. It is deliberate, regulated, necessary. The process is called apoptosis, from a Greek word meaning falling off. As leaves fall from a tree in autumn, it is not chaos. It is not rupture. It is not injury. It is a cell, dismantling itself. Carefully. Apoptosis happens constantly, in every healthy body. During the development of a human hand, the fingers are initially webbed. What separates them is not added growth, but subtraction. Cells between the forming digits receive signals, activate internal programs, and die precisely where they must, so that a hand can take its familiar shape. In the developing immune system, cells that react too strongly against the body's own tissues are identified and quietly eliminated before they can cause harm. Old cells, damaged cells, cells that have completed their useful lifespan are removed the same way, packaged into neat fragments, cleared by neighboring cells, without inflammation, without alarm. Apoptosis is, in this sense, a kind of cellular generosity. The individual cell ends itself, so that the larger organism may continue. And beyond the individual body, death plays a similar role. When an organism dies, the matter that composed it does not vanish. It changes hands. Decomposers, bacteria, fungi, invertebrates, break down tissues, release nutrients, return carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus to soil and air and water. The carbon in a fallen tree moves into fungal networks, into the atmosphere, into a new leaf. The nitrogen in muscle passes through microbes, into roots, into grain, into another body. Nothing in a functioning ecosystem is truly wasted. The towering giants of Sequoiadendron giganteum in California live for thousands of years, but their endurance depends in part on death around them. Smaller trees fall, decay, enrich the soil, create habitat. Fire sweeps through, clearing undergrowth, releasing nutrients locked in wood, and the cones of the sequoia, sealed tight, open only in the heat. What appears destructive is also renewal. Death, in ecology, is not an ending. It is transformation. Matter cycles. Air to plant. Plant to animal. Animal to soil. Soil to air again. The atoms in your body have belonged to forests, to oceans, to creatures long gone. They will belong again. The boundary between living and non-living is permeable at the level of matter. What makes something alive is not the atoms themselves, but the organization they maintain, the pattern, the process, the flow of energy and information, held temporarily in a particular form. When that organization ceases, the matter remains. Only the pattern dissolves. And in dissolving, it becomes possibility. In ending, it feeds what comes next. We are living in a period of unusual rapidity in the biological sciences. Techniques that did not exist 20 years ago now allow researchers to sequence an entire genome in hours, to edit genes with tools such as CRISPR-Cas9, to grow organ-like tissues outside the body, to trace neural circuits with astonishing precision, to examine the chemistry of single cells one by one, rather than blending them into averages that hide their individuality. The pace is real, and it is accelerating. With it come genuine possibilities and genuine responsibilities. In medicine, the ability to read a patient's genetic profile has reshaped how some diseases are understood and treated. Therapies can now be tailored, not to the statistical average case, but to the molecular details of a particular person. Gene therapy, once speculative, has entered clinical practice for certain inherited conditions. Results remain limited, carefully monitored, still evolving, but they would have seemed extraordinary not long ago. Synthetic biology, which applies engineering principles to living systems, has produced organisms capable of manufacturing medicines, materials, and fuels through biological processes. The horizon is wide. So is the need for caution. Ecology presents a different kind of urgency. The pace of biodiversity loss, driven by habitat destruction, pollution, invasive species, and shifting climate conditions, poses challenges to ecosystems at a scale unprecedented in the span of human civilization. The science describing many of these changes is clear, carefully measured, repeatedly confirmed. What to do about them is not only a biological question, it is economic, political, ethical. It concerns what societies value, what they are willing to protect, what they are willing to change. One of biology's most consistent lessons is humility. Complex systems, a cell, a coral reef, the human microbiome, regularly surprise us. Interventions designed to solve one problem have sometimes produced cascades of unintended consequences, not because the intentions were careless, but because the systems were more interconnected, more sensitive, more adaptive, than anticipated. The deeper research goes, the more intricate the networks appear. Biology also teaches patience. Evolution unfolds across generations. Ecosystems recover across decades or centuries. Biogeochemical cycles move across millennia. Human decision-making tends to operate on election cycles, on quarterly reports, on lifetimes. The mismatch in timescale is real. This is not an argument for inaction. It is an argument for care, for attention, for respect towards systems that have been functioning, adapting, for hundreds of millions of years. The future of biology is not fixed. It is being written now, in laboratories, in field stations, in hospitals, in research vessels, in genomic databases. It is also being written in farms and forests, in cities and coastlines, in the collective choices societies make about how to inhabit the biosphere. Both forms of writing matter, and both require the same quality: attention. There are questions that science illuminates without fully answering, not because science is insufficient, but because some questions reach beyond what measurement and experiment alone can hold. Biology can describe life with astonishing precision. It can map the molecular choreography inside a cell, trace the history of genes across deep time, explain how energy flows, how membranes maintain boundaries, how DNA replicates, how organisms grow. It can tell us what life does, and how it does it. What it cannot easily tell us is what it is like. For many organisms, the question of experience remains open. Does a bacterium sense, or merely respond? Does a plant leaning toward light register anything like brightness? Or is its adjustment purely biochemical? We extend the assumption of inner life most readily to animals like ourselves, less readily to those unlike us, and rarely to organisms without nervous systems. Whether that gradient reflects a real distribution of experience, or merely our own likeness looking back at us, we do not know. And yet there is one case that is not hypothetical. You are made of atoms. Atoms that are not alive, not aware, not purposeful. They follow physical law. They bind and separate. They move along gradients. They exchange energy. And somehow, arranged in a particular pattern, held in dynamic order, they generate this awareness, the sensation of the air on your skin, the faint hum in the room, the weight of your body, the fact that you are here. What is that? Not as a problem to solve, but as a fact to sit beside. The philosopher Thomas Nagel once asked what it is like to be a bat, pointing out that no accumulation of third-person data fully captures the first-person character of experience. There is something it is like to be any experiencing organism, and that something is accessible only from within. Biology tells us we are continuous. Our cells share chemistry with bacteria, with ferns, with fish, our nervous system's elaborate structures that existed in simpler form hundreds of millions of years ago. The atoms composing you have cycled through stars, oceans, forests, other bodies. You are continuous with all of it. And yet, from the inside, your perspective is singular. No one else occupies this exact vantage point, with this exact memory, this exact configuration of thoughts. At this exact moment, both are true. You are a node in a vast network, and a center of experience that no one else can inhabit. You are temporary in form, continuous in substance. Science does not diminish this. If anything, it deepens it. Right now, without asking your permission, without demanding your awareness, trillions of cells are coordinating, repairing, exchanging signals, balancing chemistry. You are being sustained by processes refined over roughly 4 billion years of evolution. You are not separate from that history. You are its current expression, whatever else that means. It seems worth knowing. One of the things that strikes many people when they first encounter the depth of biological organization is a sense that it cannot possibly be accidental. The coordination of a developing embryo, the precision of DNA replication, the extraordinary structural complexity of a cell, the ecological relationships that form food webs of almost mathematical elegance. It seems too organized, to have arisen without intent. But this intuition, powerful and understandable as it is, may be asking the wrong question. The question is not whether living systems are organized, but rather where that organization comes from, and the answer that emerges from the study of biology, and from related fields like physics and chemistry and mathematics, is that complex, organized patterns can arise from simple rules, operating over time, without a designer. The technical term for this is self-organization. Consider a snowflake, its six-sided symmetry, its intricate branching geometry, its similarity to every other snowflake in basic structure, yet its difference in exact detail. All of this arises from a single physical fact: that water molecules bond to each other in a way that favors a hexagonal arrangement, and that as a crystal grows in a supersaturated vapor, the way the crystal grows depends on the environment at each point on its surface, which in turn is shaped by the crystal's own growing form. No intelligence designed the snowflake. The physics of water molecules, playing out in a particular atmospheric environment, produced it. As it produces every snowflake, each one distinct, something similar can be said of the patterns in living systems. The spiral arrangement of seeds in a sunflower follows mathematical patterns described by what are called Fibonacci numbers, a sequence in which each number is the sum of the previous two, producing a ratio that appears repeatedly in nature. This spiral packing is not planned by the sunflower. It emerges from the local rules governing how each seed primordium is added to the growing head, each one placed at a fixed angle to the previous one, in a way that happens to maximize packing efficiency. The branching patterns of trees, the network of veins in a leaf, the structure of river deltas, the architecture of lung airways. All of these show what mathematicians call fractal properties, patterns that repeat at different scales, producing a kind of self-similar complexity. This kind of structure is an efficient way to distribute material or transport fluid across a complex three-dimensional shape, and it arises from the dynamics of growth rather than from a predetermined blueprint. Biologists studying the development of animal body plans have found that many features of animal anatomy, the spacing of limbs, the patterning of skin markings, the organization of tissues, can be explained by the behavior of systems in which two or more interacting chemical signals diffuse through tissue at different rates, producing waves of activation and inhibition that spontaneously resolve into regular patterns. The mathematician Alan Turing described this class of system decades ago, and his framework has since been used to explain the stripes of a zebrafish, the spots of a cheetah, the ridges of fingerprints, and many other biological patterns. The implication is not that biology is simple. It is that simplicity, repeated and interacting with itself, can produce complexity of great depth. Life is not simple, but the rules that generate its complexity may be relatively few. The richness of the biological world is the product not of infinite variety in its foundations, but of the extraordinary things that can emerge when a small set of consistent principles operates across billions of years of time. This is, in its own way, even more astonishing than the alternative. If life had required infinite complexity in its foundations, if every feature of every organism had to be specifically and separately arranged, the existence of life would be more puzzling, not less. But if complex patterns can emerge from simple, general rules, then the existence of life in a universe governed by physics and chemistry is not only possible, but, in the right conditions, perhaps even probable. We don't know whether life has arisen elsewhere in the universe. The question remains entirely open. But the fact that the rules of chemistry and physics, operating in a wet, energy-rich environment, can produce the biological world we see around us, that the universe contains within itself the capacity for this kind of self-organization, is something that quietly rearranges the way you see the night sky. If you let it, we have come, at last, back to where we started. A sleeping city, a forest in the dark, the slow rise and fall of a chest under blankets. Everything we have traveled through tonight, cells and DNA and evolution and energy and neurons and ecosystems and development and consciousness and death and pattern and meaning, all of it is happening right now, in the body of that sleeping person. All of it is happening right now, in you, not as a lecture, not as a diagram or a textbook chapter, but as a lived reality, quiet, ongoing, unannounced, in your cells. Right now, enzymes are moving along strands of DNA, checking for errors in sequences that have been accumulating information for billions of years. Ribosomes, molecular machines composed of RNA and protein, are reading those sequences and assembling amino acid chains into new proteins, each one destined for a specific task, each one folded into a precise three-dimensional shape by the physics of its component molecules. Mitochondria are burning glucose, spinning tiny molecular rotors to capture the released energy in ATP molecules that will, seconds later, power the next heartbeat. Your immune system is patrolling. Your gut microbiome is fermenting and signaling. Your kidneys are filtering. Your liver is processing. Your lymphatic system is clearing waste from between cells. Your bone marrow is producing new blood cells at a rate of millions per minute. And your brain, which is, in some sense, the most complex known structure in the universe, generating the experience you call you, is doing the extraordinarily ordinary work of keeping itself running during sleep, consolidating memories, clearing metabolic byproducts, maintaining the vast network of connections that makes awareness possible. You are not doing any of this intentionally. You are breathing without deciding to breathe. Your heart is beating without a thought from you. Your cells are dividing and dying and being replaced without your awareness or direction. All of this has been happening since before you were born. Since before you had a brain capable of directing anything. And will continue, with any luck, for a very long time. This is what life is. Not only the grand experiences, the moments of love or grief or discovery or wonder that feel like the meaningful chapters of a life, but also, and perhaps most fundamentally, this, the quiet, continuous, patient work of biological maintenance. The cells tending to one another in the dark. The molecules doing the same chemistry that molecules have been doing in living systems for billions of years. There is a word that sometimes gets used dismissively when applied to living things. Merely. Life is merely chemistry. We are merely biological machines. The sense of self is merely neural activity. But merely seems like the wrong word. When you really sit with the implications, the chemistry that runs a living cell is the most complex chemistry in the known universe. A biological body is an engineering achievement so far beyond current human capability that we cannot yet build a single functioning cell from scratch, let alone an organism. And the neural activity that produces this sense of self, however we ultimately explain it, produces something. Experience, awareness, the capacity to wonder. That is genuinely unprecedented in anything non-living. There is nothing mere about any of it. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote that if we could see the ordinary with sufficient attention, it would strike us as extraordinary. The ordinary fact of being a living organism. The fact that you are reading or listening to these words. That something in you is tracking their meaning. That you exist is, when held up to the light of biological understanding, genuinely astonishing. You are the current expression of a lineage that has never, in approximately 4 billion years, failed to reproduce. Every organism in your direct ancestry, from the earliest self-replicating molecules, through the first cells, through the first multicellular organisms, through the first animals, through the long chain of creatures that eventually became primates and then humans. Every single one of them survived long enough to pass something forward. The thread from the origin of life to you has never once been broken. You are the result of 4 billion years of unbroken success. That is your inheritance, not a genetic inheritance alone, though that too, but a deeper inheritance, the ongoing fact of being alive at all, which your body maintains with the same ancient chemistry, the same cellular architecture, the same fundamental processes that have run through every living thing before you. Outside, the city continues to sleep. The forest breathes in its slow way. 1 billion leaves absorbing the last traces of what light there is, holding carbon in their tissues, transpirating water vapor that will eventually return as rain. The soil beneath the trees is alive with its invisible community, breaking down the fallen and returning it, slowly, to forms that can be used again. The universe, for reasons that physics and chemistry are still slowly uncovering, arranged itself into a condition where this was possible, where matter, ordinary matter, following ordinary laws, could organize itself into cells, into organisms, into ecosystems, into something that could eventually wonder about all of it. And tonight, somewhere in a sleeping body, a cell is dividing. Another is beginning the orderly process of apoptosis. A synapse is being strengthened. A memory is being consolidated. A breath is taken in. Inside you, trillions of cells are working in silence. Life is not loud. It is patient. It is ancient. It is present. And tonight, in the quiet after this long walk through its workings, it is enough simply to notice that it continues, that the breath keeps coming, that the heart keeps its careful time, that you are here, made of the same matter as stars and soil and ancient seas, carrying inside you the accumulated wisdom of 4 billion years of biological life. The universe learned to fold itself into living form. And tonight, you are that form, breathing quietly, still. And now, as this quiet journey comes to rest, let the mind grow softer. Let the body grow heavier. There is nothing more to understand tonight. Nothing more to hold. Your cells will continue their ancient work. Your breath will continue its gentle rhythm. Your heart will keep its careful time. You can simply rest. If this space brought you even a little calm, a little wonder, a little peace, gently support the journey. You can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a quiet comment below, so this space can continue to grow. For now, close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let the same universe that learned to fold itself into living form hold you. Good night. Sleep deeply and peacefully, still, quietly, alive.